Hello everyone, my name is Rohan Gandhi, and today I'll be discussing one of the most sought-after constitutional amendments, changing the electoral system from the first-past-the-post to a proportional representation system. Now, the reason I chose to present my ideas in this way is so that I can not only provide textual and verbal evidence, but also provide some visual evidence for my points. So let's jump right in. Canada's current electoral system is based on something called first-past-the-post. This electoral system actually stems from the UK and has been with Canada since its birth as a nation. The way it works is actually quite simple to understand. There are 338 electoral districts, also known as ridings, in Canada, and each riding has its own elected member of parliament. The candidate with the most votes in a riding becomes the MP of that riding and wins a seat in the House of Commons. The party with the most seats becomes the official governing party of Canada, with the leader of that party becoming Prime Minister. The party with the second most seats becomes the official opposition. And the interesting thing about this system is that you don't need an absolute majority to win. And in fact, this has been very rare in Canadian history. Now, before moving on to some of the issues of first-past-the-post, it's worth considering some of the advantages of this system. Firstly, it gives the public a clear choice between 2 or 3 parties and actually excludes extremist parties from consideration, since it's very hard for them to gain representation without spread out geographical representation. It's very easy to comprehend for the public and count for electoral officers, and also allows the public to choose specific candidates rather than a political party. However, there are several key issues with the first-past-the-post system. Firstly, the system results in an inaccurate public representation. Secondly, the system misrepresents smaller parties. And finally, the system encourages parties to create platforms based on clan, ethnicity, or geographical region. Let's take a deeper dive into each of these issues. Unfortunately, under the first-past-the-post system, each riding is won by the candidate who receives the most votes, even if that candidate receives less than half of the total. A small advantage in the number of votes a party receives translates into a large absolute advantage in the number of seats that party's candidates win. We can see this in the table on the left, which maps out the election results of the 2011 federal election in Canada. The Conservative Party received 39.62% of the total votes cast, but won 54% of the seats in the House of Commons. If they had won a number of seats that was proportionate to the number of votes they had received, the Conservatives would only have won 122 seats instead of 167. That's a difference of 45 seats. Similarly, the NDP received 30.63% of the votes cast, but won 33.12% of the seats in the House of Commons. If they had won a number of seats proportionate to the number of votes they received, the NDP would have won 94 seats instead of 102. That's a difference of 8 seats. And even though the Green Party won almost 4% of the voting population, they only gained 1 seat. This clearly shows how first-past-the-post inaccurately represents the views of the Canadian public. Another major issue of first-past-the-post is the misrepresentation of smaller parties. Smaller party votes tend to be distributed geographically, which underrepresents them under the first-past-the-post system. Small parties that are more successful in certain geographical locations have inflated representation across the country. For example, in the 2011 election, the Green Party received 3.91% of the votes, but only 1 seat, or 0.32% of the total. With proportional representation, the Green Party would have won 12 seats. As you can see on the table on the left, votes for the Green Party fell significantly in the 2008 election, in which they received 6.78% of the votes. In that election, proportionate representation would have given them 21 seats instead of the 0 they actually won. On the other hand, first-past-the-post can give big benefits to small parties whose support is clustered geographically. For example, in 2008, the Bloc Québécois, which only fields candidates in Quebec, won 49 of that province's 75 seats. With proportionate representation, they would have won only 31 seats. The result of this issue is to create a two-party system, where power constantly shifts between 2 to 3 parties and does not represent the views of minority groups. Yet another issue with first past the post is that parties have an incentive to limit their platform's target audience. Since members of parliament can win in their riding even without a majority, parties need the most broadly accepted candidate. Unfortunately, this often means that women and minorities face barriers to gaining power in legislators. In fact, a study done by the Inter-Parliamentary Union in 2012 found that on a global scale, only 14% of governments formed based on majority-style electoral systems such as the first past the post are actually women, versus 25% in proportional systems. Finally, since clustered votes win more seats in the House of Commons than a greater number of votes spread out geographically, parties are incentivized to target platforms based on geography or ethnicity. Now that we've highlighted some of the major issues with first past the post, we turn to the alternative, proportional representation. Now, the general idea behind this system can be summed up in a single sentence. If n% of the electorate support a particular political party, then roughly n% of seats will be won by that party. This means that all votes contribute to the results, not just a plurality or a bare majority, like in first past the post. There are several types of proportional representation systems. Party lists, where political parties define candidate lists and voters vote for a list. The relative vote for each list determines how many candidates from each list are actually elected. Then there's single transferable vote, which uses small multiple member districts with voters ranking individual candidates in order of preference. And finally, there's mixed member, where voters typically have 2 votes, one for their single member district and one for the party list. The party list vote determining the balance of parties in the elected body. Now, these prevalent forms of proportional representation all require the use of multiple member voting districts, also called super districts, as it is not physically possible to fill a single seat in a proportional manner. So, what is the rationale behind implementing proportional representation? Firstly, it accurately translates number of votes to seats in Parliament, and seat bonuses for larger parties are minimized. Secondly, it creates greater representation for minority parties. Thirdly, it encourages parties to campaign beyond districts in which they are strong. And finally, it creates a greater continuity and stability of policy. Let's take a deeper look of what each of these rationales mean. A proportional representation electoral system faithfully translates votes cast into seats won, and thus avoids some of the more destabilizing and unfair results thrown up by plurality or majority electoral systems, such as first past the post. Seat bonuses for the larger parties are actually minimized, and smaller parties can have their voice heard in legislature. This means that power won't constantly shift between 2 or 3 large parties, and governments will form a coalition where smaller voices will be forced to be heard. Proportional representation systems also facilitate minority parties' access to representation. Unless the threshold is unduly high or the district magnitude is unusually low, then any political party with even a small percentage of the vote can gain representation in the legislature. This fulfills the principle of inclusion, which can be crucial to stability in divided societies and has benefits for decision-making in established democracies, such as achieving a more balanced representation of minorities in decision-making bodies and providing role models of minorities as elected representatives. Furthermore, it will incentivize voters to vote more, especially to those who do not favor any of the major political parties, as their political choice will have a greater chance of winning a seat in Parliament. Under first-past-the-post systems, clustered votes do not give parties more seats compared to geographically spread out votes. In order to gain power, parties will be forced to gain representation across Canada and not just select regions. This makes it less likely that a party will win most or all of the seats in a specific region. For example, the Bloc Québécois party had a lot of favor in and around the region of Quebec, which allowed them to win seats under first past the post. But if the party wants to continue being in power under a proportional representative system, it will have to gain the support of many more regions beyond Quebec. The result is that political campaigns will address the needs of diverse groups across Canada, and not just select groups based on ethnicity or geographical location. According to a recent study done by the Western European Experience Group, parliamentary proportional representative systems score better with regards to governmental longevity, voter participation, and economic performance. Regular switches in government between two ideologically polarized parties, as can happen in first-past-the-post systems, makes long-term economic planning and prosperity more difficult. Broad proportional representative coalition governments help engender a stability and coherence in decision-making which allow for national development. Now that we've covered the rationale behind the reform, let us now examine what processes that reform would have to undergo to take effect. Interestingly, there's not a clear answer in Canadian law, and is in fact the subject of debate amongst constitutional scholars in Canada. They are essentially stuck on two main questions. One, does Canada's electoral system form as part of Canada's constitution? And two, if so, which amending procedure under Part 5 of the Constitution Act of 1982 is appropriate? In other words, does Parliament need provincial consent to change the federal electoral system? Now let's examine the views of constitutional scholars. Most scholars agree that electoral reform would require a constitutional amendment. Although an amending procedure for electoral reform is not explicitly mentioned in the written text, the electoral system forms as part of the constitutional architecture of Canada. However, the debate lies between which amending procedure is appropriate. The general amending procedure under Section 38 of Part 5 of the Constitution Act of 1982, or the unilateral federal procedure under Section 44. Advocates for Section 38 argue that a consequence of the constitutional architecture approach is a lack of clarity over whether provincial consent is required. As such, some scholars have argued that the general amending procedure must be applied since provincial interests are affected, and it is not stated otherwise. Michael Powell argues that the general amending procedure was used in the past for Senate reform, and electoral reform should follow the same procedure. On the other hand, some scholars argue that it is not clear if provincial interest in federal electoral reform extends beyond the proportion of seats that they are afforded. Leonid Sirota wrote that a change to the electoral system would not necessarily amount to a change in the fundamental nature and role of the mainstream reform options that are usually considered, and that federal electoral reform does not implicate provincial interests as much as Senate reform. While this debate is constantly pursuing and exists, in my personal opinion, Section 44 is sufficient for electoral reform mainly because the requirement of a 750 amendment is difficult to achieve and would make electoral reform in the future unfeasible and would greatly affect Canada's ability to achieve democratic order. There are several consequences of amending Canada's electoral system from a first-past-the-post system to a proportional representation system from a variety of perspectives. Firstly, from the perspective of large parties, who may be forced to form coalitions with smaller parties. From the perspective of smaller parties, who may have a larger voice but must also pave the way for extremist parties in legislature. From the perspective of voters, who may face difficulty removing an unfavorable candidate or party from power because of the coalition style of government. And finally, from the perspective of legislation being passed, which may be difficult due to the numerous amounts of parties being represented in a coalition government, causing gridlock. Let's take a deeper dive into each of these. From the perspective of large political parties, a proportional representative system will likely form a coalition government, with multiple parties being represented in parliament. As such, large parties may be forced to form coalitions with much smaller parties in order to pass resolutions. This gives a party that has the support of only a small percentage of the votes the power to veto any proposal that comes from larger parties, which could potentially be dangerous in the fundamental democracy of Canada and its legislature. From the perspective of small parties, although they will gain greater representation in Parliament, they may be able to join forces with other small parties to make demands to larger parties or veto certain resolutions. It also gives a space in the legislature to extremist parties of the left or right wing. Despite representing a small proportion, these parties will have the power to sway the direction of legislation by working with other parties, the Communist Party being an example of one of these extremist parties. From the perspective of voters, under a proportional representative system, it may be difficult to remove a reasonably sized center party from power. When governments are usually coalitions, some political parties are ever present in the government, despite weak electoral performances from time to time. The Free Democratic Party in Germany is an example of this. It was a member of the governing coalition for all but 8 of the 50 years from 1949 to 1998 in Germany, and it never gained more than 12% of the vote. From the perspective of legislation being passed, coalition governments, which in turn lead to legislative gridlock and consequently inability to carry out coherent policies. There are particularly high risks during an immediate post-conflict transition, when popular expectations of new governments are high. This ultimately affects the ability to achieve quick and coherent decision-making, and this can be impeded by coalition cabinets and governments of national unity which are split by factions. Although these are some consequences of the proportional representative system, it should be noted that it is a fairer representation of the Canadian public compared to a first-past-the-post system, and should be implemented as a constitutional amendment to achieve a well-represented democracy. Thank you for your time.